have an impromptu seminar and to invite a colleague and friend from Canada, Professor Jill Hobbs, who is a distinguished professor of agricultural economics at the University of Saskatchewan. Based in Saskatoon. Yes, I found that difficult. And we're also very delighted to have Professor Bill Kerr here, who is Emeritus Professor of Agricultural Trade. Now, there's a backstory to this because Jill and I did our economics degrees at Aberystwyth together. We staggered through our micro and macro economics. I kind of didn't, the carrot growing and stuff was not for me. I went back to more economics. You pursued agriculture more, or was your undergraduate?
It's economics,
yeah.
Yeah,
You then got interested in agriculture.
Yes, we switched.
We switched. And then we went through Bill, who was a visiting lecturer, senior lecturer, sabbatical, over in Aberystwyth. We finished our degree, our final exams, and we were interviewed to go to Canada on a teaching scholarship, which was amazing because it paid for everything. We were teaching first-year economics students and helping them these big programs. We went from Aberystwyth with 3,000 students to Calgary that had 25,000 students. And we went skiing together, and I'm actually taking Jill on the Straits Rib ride this afternoon because I felt we had to do something with a bit of adventure in it. But to earn that, she's going to give us a lecture, and we're delighted because of the very strong links between agriculture, trade, commercialised food, and big negative influences on food in a lot of developed countries. There's a lot of room for what we're now calling transdisciplinary research, including climate research. So over to you, Jill, and there'll be lots of time for questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhiannon. It's great to be here. I've enjoyed meeting a few of you already, and I'm looking forward to some conversations afterwards. So, as Rhiannon gave me this title, Reflections on Applied Economics of Food, Health and Climate Change, that's what I'm going to chat about. I won't talk too much about climate change, but as you'll see, some of my more recent work looks at consumer demand for sustainability, and we're starting to do some work on what they're calling climate smart agriculture and how consumers might respond to that. So, I'm trying to go down, let's see. Why is it not moving? Let's see. It should. It was working just now. Okay, good. So, a quick roadmap. I'm going to talk a little bit more about my background and my research interests, and then talk about something you probably know a fair bit about already, but what are the factors driving obesity, and what are some of the insights from economics that help us kind of unpack some of those driving factors? What sort of policy interventions do we see governments try? And in terms of policy interventions, obviously there's lots. I'm really interested in information, right? How consumers respond to information about food and health. So that's what I'll talk a little bit more about. And I'll give you a little bit of flavour of some of the work I've done on that. So how consumers are responding to different food labels, done some work on how different countries regulate health claims on food products. And then I'll finish up a little bit with some recent work we've been doing on consumer responses to plant-based meat alternatives. So these are the Beyond Burgers, the food that meat or products that are made often from pea and soy to mimic the taste and texture of meat. And often the motivation for choosing these products is health or environmental. So we've been trying to dig in a little bit to try and understand those motivations and do some work, again, related to labelling. So that's what I want to talk about this morning. If you've got questions as I go, feel free to jump in, or we can also chat at the end. So, as Rhiannon said, I'm a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Saskatchewan. So Saskatchewan's in the western part of Canada, in the prairies. I've been there, I can't believe, I've been there 26 years. That's kind of shocking. But so I started out life, as Rhiannon said, in economics. I did an undergraduate degree in we did in Aberystwyth, but I grew up on a dairy farm in the southwest part of England, so I've always been interested in agriculture, and I didn't know agricultural economics existed until I got to Aberystwyth and discovered there was a separate department of ag economics, as we call it. So I gradually transitioned to become an agricultural economist through my master's, in Calgary, and then I did my PhD in Scotland, in Aberdeen. So I work on primarily food supply chains. I'm really interested in how those relationships operate across the supply chain, from farmers to food processors and retailers. And then more recently became interested in consumer behavior, how consumers make food choices, and that also plays into that information. How does information flow up the supply chain? Do consumers trust different types of information and so forth? And then food policy is another thing I've done a fair bit of work on, food labeling, food safety and so forth. So I teach kind of generally in those areas, undergrad and graduate or postgraduate courses on supply chains, and a new class I've started teaching recently to undergraduates, food economics and consumer behaviour. And I really enjoy that actually. I've got a module on food and health in that particular class. So a little bit about me. So what I've worked on recently, and I'll delve into some of this a little bit more, but as I said, we're quite interesting lately on consumers and sustainability labelling. So I've got a couple of research projects where we're looking at how might consumers respond to a climate smart certification. So I'm working in our agriculture faculty. We've got plant scientists, animal scientists, food scientists, soil scientists, so they're doing all the science. They're trying to develop crops that are more resilient to pests, diseases, and so forth. And some of that question is, well, will consumers consume these food products? Will farmers grow these crops? So some of that project is looking at how might consumers respond to food products that are certified or marketed to have a lower impact or more positive climate impact. So that's a project that's just finishing up right now, where we were looking at how might you frame the benefits of climate smart, because of course the real problem is greenwashing. That, you know, there's so many signals out there for consumers about environment. Who do consumers really trust the information? And then similarly, we had a project a few years ago on broad versus narrow sustainability labels. I can talk about that later if you like. I will touch on the plant-based meat alternatives a little bit later. So why do consumers choose these food products? And particularly, I'll chat about this project that we just finished up on the role of labels, health claims versus environmental claims. So why do I think this is interesting? I think it's really important to really try and drill into how consumers make choices about food and why that matters. So again, as I've said, how does information affect consumers' food choices, be it on the food label, what types of information? There's a huge literature on this, but that's something that's really motivated my research. Recently, we've done a fair bit of work on trust. So who do consumers trust for information? Government, private sector, farmers, just some consumers, and why. I already mentioned certification. I won't talk about this today, but a fair bit of work has also looked at how consumers respond to new food technology. So a lot of that, of course, is gene editing. So that's moving on beyond genetic modification to using genomics and gene editing, CRISPR and so forth. That's gradually being used a lot more now in crop breeding, and we're interested in, well, how might consumers respond to that? Might you get the same negative backlash that we got from genetic modification? And then really trying to unpack heterogeneity. Obviously, consumers are really heterogeneous in their choice behaviours. So let's switch to a few things. Think a little bit about obesity, diet-related diseases. Of course, as you probably know better than I would do in this area, are a leading cause of avoidable morbidity and mortality, cardiovascular disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and so forth. So as Rihanna said, food is really key here in terms of health. Now, I'm not a health economist, so I'm coming at this from my interest in food and how consumers make food choices, but hopefully this overlaps a little bit. I'm sure you're all familiar with these types of graphic in terms of the rates of overweight and obesity among adults. This is some data from OECD 2023. So we can see that, you know, the OECD average, around 60% of adults are either overweight or obese, whereas the UK here just slightly above, I think, the OECD average at what, 62 or 3%, and of course the US over 70% of adults. So that's a real challenge in terms of our population and the rates of overweight and obesity. There was a story in the news, was it yesterday, about the number of children worldwide that are overweight and obese is now higher than the number that are suffering from malnutrition in the world. I mean, I think that's really quite shocking that that's happened for children. So big challenge. Canada's sort of close to the OECD average, and those rates of overweight and obesity, of course, have been rising over time. So what are some of the drivers of these of obesity? Of course, too much of a surprise, unhealthy diets, inadequate physical exercise, two key drivers. But if we drill a bit further, of course, some of these are socioeconomic factors, environmental factors, and behavioural. And I'm particularly interested in the behavioural factors. So socioeconomic factors, clearly there's some age and gender, some physiological differences that are related to obesity. I think income and education are kind of interesting. So we know in developed countries, there's generally speaking, it's not a linear relationship, but broadly speaking, a negative relationship between income and education and rates of obesity. So as you get higher education income, you tend to get lower rates of obesity, and the opposite relationship in many developing countries, a positive relationship between income and education. So as incomes increase, rates of obesity increase as well. And of course, many developing countries have this twin challenge of both overnutrition and undernutrition in their populations, which is really challenging to think about how to manage that. So we're economists, can't talk about economics without talking about prices. So an important socioeconomic factor is relative prices. So the current, the recent food price inflation notwithstanding, really the real price of food has fallen dramatically relative to other goods over the last 4 or 5 decades or so. So relatively speaking, food is cheap. I mean, we have a very efficient food system. Food is cheap, so prices are lower, demand's going to be higher, right? So that's an obvious driver, potentially, of why people might consume too much food. And then the opportunity cost of time for exercise, food preparation is higher, with people leading busy lives, another key socioeconomic factor. Environmental factors, changes to what we might class as the food environment. A lot of things usually discussed under this. So, for example, the availability of low-cost, convenient processed food. So the food industry has become very efficient at producing, as Rihanna mentioned, processed foods. They're very convenient, and they're obviously not always very healthy. So that graphic on the right there is from a couple of years ago now, but you see that growth in ready-made meals, market growth in the United States. That's so trending upwards from 2014 to 2024, a big increase in just the availability of these types of food. The other big factor in terms of our food environment is the growth in what we call food away from home consumption, right? So this is restaurants, cafes, institutional food consumption. The United States, I think that's now at about 55% of food expenditures are outside the home. I think Canada, I think the UK is around a third, is that right? Are you familiar? About 35% or so of food expenditures are outside the home. So that's often when we're doing this research, and my research is mostly focused on decisions people make in the grocery store. Of course, what that misses is the fact that a lot of food we're purchasing is in cafes, restaurants, and so forth. So that's, again, not necessarily particularly healthy. So that's also a big change in the food environment, the fact we're consuming food that's not necessarily purchased to consume at home. Snack food category, so the food marketers, for them this is a big growth category in recent years, consumers liking snacking, so lots of the new food development is in snacks, which are obviously not always particularly healthy. And lastly, portion sizes. Do you remember, Rihanna, when we first went to Canada, you told me never order a large of anything? And she was right. And so if I went to Canada, I could never finish a meal, and unfortunately now I can, so this is not good, but growing portion sizes. The bowl of soup there is to remind me of a research, to tell you a story about a research study I came across a few years ago. There's some researchers in the US, interested in this problem with large portion sizes. So the portion sizes in the US, even bigger than in Canada, much, much bigger. So they were interested in digging into this. So they did a survey of consumers, I think if I remember correctly, in France and in the US. And they asked the consumers, how do you know when it's time to stop eating? And the consumers in France would tend to say things like, well, I feel full, the food no longer tastes as good, that's when I stop eating. Consumers in the US, what do you think they said? When's it time to stop eating?
When it's finished.
When it's finished, yeah, when my plate's empty. So they thought, I wonder what would happen if your plate never got empty. So they created this study where they invited some people in to participate in the study, and people sat around the table afterwards for lunch, and they had a bowl of soup. And some of the people had a regular bowl of soup, but others, they didn't realise, had a little tube at the bottom of the bowl that led to a big vat of soup. And as they ate their soup, and it would just keep refilling. So the bowl never emptied. And then they measured, of course, how much more people ate. And then they asked them afterwards, do you think you ate more? Because they didn't know at the time they had a jerry-rigged bowl of soup. And they said, no, I didn't eat more than I needed. But of course they showed statistically that people ate a lot more when their food plate never emptied. So I thought that was kind of an interesting study. So yeah, portion sizes just got bigger. And I think here too, actually, I'm going to come back and visit. Portion sizes are growing. Other environmental factors, changes in labour markets, of course, most people in a household working, again, less time for food preparation at home, and just the changes in our built environment with most of us, urban sprawl, people using cars, poor supply of public transportation. That's particularly a problem in, I think, North America. It's a little bit better in Europe. That's my perspective anyway, with public transportation. And just health inequalities in terms of so-called food deserts, whether people have access to supermarkets and grocery stores in their neighbourhood, and that tends to be poorer communities that have less access, often don't have a vehicle, difficult to get fresh food. So those environmental factors. And then, as I said, behavioural factors and preferences, that's where I'm particularly interested in. So food consumption is highly habitual, right? We tend to be very habitual in how we make food decisions, and those habits are often formed in childhood. So that's why some of those interventions at the for childhood stage are really important in healthier eating patterns. Just self-control and time discounting. So we tend to discount benefits that are in the future relative to present. So I want to diet. I know that's going to lead to better long-run health outcomes, but I'm hungry right now. And there's a great chocolate cake out there by the tea or something. So I put off making a decision that might be healthier. And food marketers, of course, know all about this, so they build that into their food marketing strategies with, buy one, get one free. Would you like dessert with that? So I had a job as a student for a while in a fast food. It's in Aberystwyth, in the Wimpy, I think it was at the time, and we had to watch a little training video at the beginning. It was all about how to get people to order more food. So you'd have to always say, oh, would you like fries with that, or would you like a Coke with that? So I don't think I ever did that, so I didn't last long in that job. Anyway, and product positioning. So lots of things in the food environment and food marketing strategies that play on this these behavioural factors. So in economics, how do we think about these decisions that consumers are making? So if we take sort of our standard consumer utility theory, we would say, well, consumers are rational utility maximizers, right? So if there's rational consumers can evaluate these substitutes and trade-offs. So there's a trade-off between work and leisure, right? So work gives us disutility, leisure gives us positive utility, but work gives us income and so forth.
Work gives us utility.
Utility. So when you're working with Rhiannon, it gives you lots of utility. And same with calorie intake. It's pleasurable, gives us a lot of utility versus long-run health outcomes. So consumers are weighing up these trade-offs. Already mentioned this notion of the falling real price of food over time. So food is becoming cheaper. But particularly unhealthy processed foods, these are cheap foods, so McDonald's is a cheap meal, right? Relative to healthy foods, unprocessed foods that are, relatively more expensive. So again, a rational consumer weighing up that, I'm going to maybe, if I'm responding to those relative prices, I'm more likely to be purchasing more unhealthy foods. And then again, as I sort of alluded to earlier, that relative time cost of meals prepared at home has risen for two reasons. Again, food industries become very efficient, mass production of processed foods, these foods are away from home, and I've got less time because I'm busy doing everything else at home. So again, if we were to take a very narrow sort of utility maximizing role of this, we would say, well, fully rational consumers, they're weighing up all these trade-offs, they're making utility maximizing decisions. That's what's happening. Now, of course, there's other externalities to those decisions if they're developing health outcomes that become long-term and so forth. But, of course, there's more to it than that. So we want to also consider, well, behavioural economics tells us, well, that's not always how consumers make decisions. They're not necessarily these rational utility maximising agents. So our insights from behavioural economics tell us, well, maybe consumers aren't these rational agents making these perfectly decisions based on perfect full information, lots of constraints in terms of time, cognitive constraints in terms of boundary rationality. Can you actually weigh up all these and make the optimal decision? And we know that consumers, in fact, use heuristics. We all do that, shortcuts, right? Decision rules. So we make decisions. If you go to the grocery store when you're hungry, you're going to make a different decision. And food marketers, again, know about that. The way they place foods in the supermarket plays on this. And as I already mentioned, food decisions are highly habitual. So what does that tell us? Well, maybe individuals don't respond or respond as much as we think they might do to a change in prices. So if one of our policy interventions is to tax unhealthy, a fat tax or sugar tax, we're hoping that changes behaviour, but maybe, it might, but it depends how much, if food consumptions are very habitual, how much will consumers respond to that change in prices, and similarly, will they respond to new information, again, if in terms of habit formation. So how might you break those habits, I guess, would be another question. So obviously lots of policy tools available to try and address some of these health and nutrition externalities related to obesity. How do we evaluate that policy impact in terms of some of the stuff we see in food economics, so I'm sure in your area too? Often we're obviously measuring things like change in behaviours. Did this policy intervention, say it's a tax on sugar, or we labelled unhealthy ingredients, did it lead to a change in consumption behaviour? Can we measure whether it reduced the consumption of unhealthy foods? Or can we measure whether it increased the consumption of really healthy foods? Or can we somehow evaluate if it improved the information environment? Obviously, the important question really is, the last one there, did the policy intervention actually improve long-run health outcomes? That's incredibly difficult to measure, as you'll all be well aware, right? So often we're left with, well, let's see if we can measure some of these other things and hope that it measures. So it's not obviously the same as some of your colleagues were doing randomized controlled trials that we talked about the other day. So how do we measure that? I took this table out of this nice little paper by Mazziocchi et al. Fat Economics, Nutrition, Health and Economic Policy. And I think it summarises some of the policy interventions quite nicely related to food. So they summarise them in terms of market intervention and information. So I'm going to talk more about information, but just briefly, market intervention measures at the top there, taxing unhealthy nutrients. So that's clearly one thing governments do. So is the UK government doing that? Is there? And
so we had a sugar tax.
Sugar tax, yeah.
And interestingly, the behaviour change was on firms who then reduced their sugar to avoid being taxed. So then the public gained the lower sugar drinks without making a decision.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm going to talk about it in a minute. Yes, like understanding the strategic response of firms is really important, because if firms reformulate, then you might get that outcome that way. Okay.
They did also change the size of the cans. So like Coke cans used to be 330 ml, and now they're like 250 or something like that. To
get around, so I think that's exactly right. So figuring out how firms might respond to some of these policies is really important, or subsidising healthy nutrients. Food standards, so setting nutritional standards for processed products to limit access to unhealthy nutrients or so forth. So I'm going to talk about plant-based meat alternatives in a minute. So I don't know how we do it in the UK, but in Canada, if you're going to market a plant-based meat alternative, it has to have a certain protein content to be, equivalent as a protein substitute for meat. So that's a good example of a food standard that says, no, you can't just, it has to meet these protein standards. I haven't seen this one ever. Regulate the liability of food companies to monetize negative externalities from production, sale of unhealthy foods. I guess they've tried that with tobacco, so who knows. And then addressing some of these access to grocery shopping infrastructure. So trying to deal with some of these food deserts in terms of access to fresh food in disadvantaged areas. I'll talk a little bit more about information measures. So again, lots of examples of I'll expand on some of these in just a second, but information campaigns or so-called social marketing, just to increase consumer awareness about what makes a healthy diet. Obviously nutrition education programs in schools, ways foods is labelled to try and highlight healthy or unhealthy ingredients. And I'll give you an example of a couple of studies in that area in just a second. Governments regulate health and nutrition claims, and they've done a little bit of work in this. The interesting thing there is different countries have vastly different ways in which they regulate that, the type of health claims you can make about food. Calorie labelling on menus, is that required in the UK now? I've seen it a little bit or not, where you have calorie labelling on menus.
Depending on the size of the restaurant.
Is that right? Yeah. I think that they've done that in a few provinces in Canada too, so forth. And then things like, limiting advertising of unhealthy foods to children before certain hours and so forth. So different ways in which we can try and influence the information environment to hopefully have people make healthier food decisions. So I want to talk a little bit more about that, because that's really where some of my interest lies, in this information environment. So social marketing, public information campaigns, nutrition information, so dietary guidelines, the images there, the plate in the middle there is Canada's food guide that they completely revamped it in 2019 to be a little bit like you have in the UK, which is the Eat Well guide on the right hand side there, which basically shows things in sort of a plate. So half your plate should be fresh fruits and vegetables, a quarter, I guess, protein, a quarter whole grain foods, and I think the Eat Well guide is quite similar in terms of types of foods. I'm in an agricultural economics department, so lots of our students, of course, are from farms and connected to the agriculture industry. When Canada changed its food guide, because it used to have a food guide, I think a lot of countries did, with you should have so much meat, so much dairy, and they named the commodities. So when they changed it to this, which is now, half your plate should be fresh fruits and vegetables, quarter protein, so they're not mentioning you should consume beef or dairy, right? There was this howl of protest from the agriculture sector, from the farmers' groups, that this was terrible, and I think that did them a lot of disservice, because it's kind of sending the message that the farmers care about themselves and not about consumers. I talked to my students about that, because they're all from farms, and they were, this is terrible, and I said, well, no, you're trying to inform consumers a little bit better. And then these public information campaigns like Know the Salty Six, I think was one that might have run in the UK a while back, and so forth. And I think from what I've seen, there's evidence this tends to raise awareness, but it's a lot harder to see if there's a link between whether it changes behaviour. Okay? And I think it depends a little bit on people with better nutrition knowledge tend to respond more to these types of education campaigns. Where it does make a difference, so I think that's the point that Rhiannon just made, there was a really interesting study, I think it might have been the sodium campaign in the UK, where they showed it made a difference through firms reformulating. So firms reformulated food products as a result of this, and maybe consumers benefit because of that strategic response from firms. So I think that's a really interesting strand of research, and not something I do, but looking at how firms might respond to some of these public information campaigns.
Could I ask just around that, is it evidence of maybe the producers themselves, the farmers adapting and changing similar to the way the firms are, maybe in terms of their product mix or something, or they will plant some more crops instead of cattle or something like that?
They tend to not so much, I guess. A little bit on the pea side. So one of the big growth in peas is the pea protein. So there's, but often they're more, if the pea is less, if the pea is susceptible to diseases, then they can keep growing wheat and canola and that type of thing.
They're a bit more entrenched maybe than the firms.
Yeah, exactly. But if you're a beef farmer with a big beef, you're not going to switch into growing peas. It's depending on the situation. So they have less flexibility. If you're a dairy farmer, that's what you tend to be. So no, it's a good point.
I mean, our diversification in this country has been much into the holiday industry and things like that. So they're tied into a lot of big contracts with big food producers.
Right.
So the apples, but we do have things called wonky vegetables.
Yes.
In Morrison's.
That's right. That are ugly but tasty or something. Right? Yeah, those are quite good. Exactly. So. And of course, another important aspect of food labelling is mandatory nutrition labelling. So that nutrition facts panel that we see on packaged food products. So that became mandatory in the US, actually way back in 1990. So they were fairly early in doing that. We didn't do that in Canada till 2007. And as far as I can tell, that's even more recent in the UK. So when the EU put that in place in 2016. So, and over time, these have They've tried to improve these to make them a little bit more accessible to consumers, to understand them, but basically, you know, what in Canada, I think we recently standardized the serving size because it was different across food products, which is really confusing. And lots of work has been done trying to figure out what factors influence the effectiveness of nutrition labeling. So clearly the person, do consumers actually read the labels? We often ask in our surveys, a lot of my work is survey-based, do you read food labels? And they say, oh yes, I still read food labels. And we did one with a discrete choice experiment on it, where consumers could see a package of food, and we were interested in how they'd respond to actually ingredient lists, long versus short ones. And they could, some of the survey respondents automatically saw the ingredient list. The others had to click to get the packet to turn over like you would in the supermarket. And we found that a lot of consumers said, oh, I always read the ingredients and I always read the labels. And then in this survey, some of them, you know, didn't click. So we can measure how much they actually did look at the information that they could have had about the food product. So, do consumers read the labels? We know that they tend to be more effective nutrition facts panels with consumers that have more, an existing base of nutrition knowledge. They know how to use that information. Consumers' current health status is important. And again, label design, as I said, ease of comprehension. So, consumers that struggle to understand numerical information will a little bit challenged with nutrition facts panel. And again, do firms reformulate? What's the strategic response from food firms, and is that good or bad? So there's some evidence, for example, when countries started requiring trans fats to be labelled, that firms actually reformulated to take out the trans fats. So that's probably good outcome, right? Or rounding of calorie and nutrient levels. So they play around with the food products. So how do firms respond? So often, again, we're focused on consumers. It's important to consider how firms respond. So we've got mandatory nutrition labelling, and then we see this big growth in what we call front of package labelling. So sort of this is really applying to that heuristic shortcut. So simplified front of package labelling. So the that traffic light label on the top right, you've seen that one. So that one came, I think it was Tesco's that started that one. So these tend to be voluntary initiatives often. From the food sector. So in the traffic light one that you're familiar with, so you're low, green being low, orange I guess medium, and red high, so high in saturated fats. The black and white one in the middle there is called the facts up front label. So that's from the United States. So that's General Mills that started that one. So very similar kind of idea, but they are labeling some of the key nutrients here. As well as vitamin A and potassium. The blue stars there, it's called guiding stars. So that's a shelf labelling system. I think it began in the United States. We've got one retailer that uses it in Canada. So it's based on the Canada Food Guide, and the 3 stars means this is healthy, 2 stars a little bit less healthy, and so forth. So this is on a shelf label, the guiding stars. And I'm going to talk about a project in a minute where we tried to tease out how consumers responded to these types of labels. And then lastly, that green one, that's called the keyhole label, that's out of Scandinavia. So that is supposed to indicate a food product that's healthier within a category. So let's say breakfast cereal. If it's a healthier breakfast cereal within the category of breakfast cereals, a food firm can apply to put on that keyhole label. So that's overseen by I think the Danish government on behalf of the other Scandinavian countries. So again, a lot of interesting questions here in terms of these are essentially simplifying decision-making heuristics. Consumers make decisions quickly. How is it influencing consumers' food purchase decisions? And again, how might firms, what might be the strategic response of food manufacturers? So what if firms can apply these labels to less healthy products like soft drinks and fruit juices? So it's implying it's healthy, but we know that's you're better off consuming water or something. And then are there halo effects? So in other words, do consumers just focus on one of these? So up here, and that this is low in sugar, 1%. Okay, so this is, and I'm a consumer, and I'm just focused on the green that it says low in sugar, and I'm in fact ignoring the fact that it's really high in saturated fats. How are consumers actually taking all this information into consideration? And does it encourage, I think this is an interesting one, compensating behaviours? So I feel really good because I had, my main course was, I bought at the supermarket was lots of green, and then I can reward myself with a chocolate cake or something. And one of the things people were interested in is well, does this information substitute for the nutrition facts panel, or is it complement to? So are people using these front of package labels instead of nutrition facts panel or together? So that last question we were quite interested in. So we did a little study a few years ago. So this is the paper that came out of it, Consumer Responses to Private Nutrition Signals. So Van was a graduate student, myself and a colleague. So this was a survey, a very small survey actually, of consumers in Western Canada. And we really were interested in how they might respond to a traffic light label. We don't have that in Canada, or this guiding stars shelf label, which you do see in some retail stores in Canada. So it's just a really simple survey. We found, as you perhaps might, not surprising, the traffic light label is more intuitive. People tend to think, that's a more useful way of learning about the food. And what would we find? Well, trust really matters. So we tried to measure whether they trust the. If you don't trust the label, clearly you're not going to want to use it. Ease of use really mattered, and nutrition knowledge. So we did that in a self-assessed way about the nutrition knowledge. So more consumers with higher self-assessed nutrition knowledge, again, seem to be more responsive to these food labels. And this is a small sample, but we found those nutrition labels seem to complement rather than substitute for the nutrition facts table. People would use them together, which I thought was quite encouraging. But all right. So nutrition labels. Let's switch to another type of policy intervention related to information, and that's regulation of health claims on food products. And this is the image on the left is a book that myself and two colleagues did about 10 years ago now, so it's a while ago, but regulating health food. So we were interested in digging into how different countries were regulating these foods with these health claims. So generally speaking, there's sort of two categories of these health claims. We call them function claims. Sort of there's two examples on the screen there. Protein helps build antibodies is an example of a function claim. So it's just related to the general physiological functioning of the body, I guess. Or vitamin D helps build strong bones and teeth. So those are what we call function claims that you can put on food products in Canada. Or more, a little bit more detailed disease risk reduction claims, right? So that's linking consumption of food to potential disease risk reduction. So those are two examples here. A healthy diet low in saturated and trans fats may reduce the risk of heart disease. This food is low in saturated and trans fats. Or a healthy diet with adequate calcium and vitamin D and regular physical activity helps to achieve strong bones and may reduce the risk of osteoporosis. This food is very high in calcium and vitamin D. So Canada, I haven't looked lately, but at the time there's around 20 or so of these disease risk reduction claims that are permitted on food products. In the United States, they have a much more sort of laissez-faire approach to their regulation of health claims. We have similar food markets with quite an integrated economies, despite Donald Trump's attempts to make it other than that. But anyway, they don't regulate function claims, so you can pretty much put any type of function claim on a food product unless someone objects. And they have a much broader range of disease risk reduction claims. So that's one of the challenges in the sense that these standards of evidence differ between countries, although the science presumably is the same. So in Canada, we rely a lot on some of the science that's been done in the United States, but we have a much smaller range of allowable health claims. They differ between countries. So the image on the right of that, I think it's soy milk. This is from the United States. So it has a whole bunch of different health claims on here that wouldn't be permitted in Canada. We don't allow. I think that DHA omega-3 supports brain health. We don't currently have that as a permitted health claim, and so forth. So I think there's a really interesting tension here in terms of a policy balance. Presumably if we trust the science, these health claims are accurate. You want to encourage people to make healthier food choices, right? But you also want to protect them from misleading health claims. So sort of how far do you go in allowing these types of health claims? So that's something we looked at that in that book, trying to look at how different countries were regulating these function claims and particularly these disease risk reduction claims. And then the last thing I wanted to just touch on, time yet, was some current work and recent work on plant-based meat alternatives. Again, these are these Beyond Meat, these not your old veggie burgers, but making products that mimic the taste, texture of meat. So we were interested in why are consumers choosing these products. It was a big growth category that's tailed off now. I think these products are expensive and so forth. And there's lots of interesting questions about labelling in terms of what you're allowed to label these products and the type of how consumers might respond to health-related versus environmental-related. So I'm just going to really quickly summarise these two recent projects. So one we're just finishing up now is just trying to dig into why consumers choose to consume these products in the first place. Are they going to keep consuming them, and why might they stop? And then the second project was influence of the regulatory environment, meat-related terms. So when these products were first introduced, the meat industry was a lot of lobbying saying, well, you shouldn't be allowed to call this a burger because it's misleading, or a sausage and so forth. So a lot of pushback. So some states in the US, I think, and France for a while, banned the use of, I think Italy's looked at doing that, banned the use of meat-related terms on plant-based meat alternatives because they argued it was misleading. Canada was trying to sort out its regulatory stance at the time, so we dug into that a little bit. And then in that project, we also looked at how consumers responded to a health-related versus an environmental claim. So there are two allowable health claims for plant-based meat alternatives in Canada. What we call a protein content claim, which is excellent source of protein, so that's a regulated claim, it has to have a certain number of grams of protein, versus a protein quality claim, a complete source of protein. So folks we're working with are quite interested in, well, we can make either of these claims, what would resonate more? And then environment's often touted as a reason consumers like these products, so we have an environmental claim. So we're interested in unpacking some of these things. So just quickly, this survey was done just a few months ago, about 1,000 consumers across Canada. It's not a huge sample, but what are some of the reasons consumers try plant-based meat alternatives? So this was an open-ended survey question. We didn't give them a list. We first of all said, well, tell us why you initially tried plant-based meat alternatives. So not surprising, in blue, it was given as they could give 3 reasons. So this was one of the 3 reasons, or in orange, the primary reason. Curiosity, that's pretty clear. People would choose it because they're curious. But if you look at the second bar there, nutrition, health. So a lot of people, I think they're healthier, right? Whether they are or not, I think is another question, but I'm going to consume them because I think they're healthier. If you look way to the right, environment was rarely mentioned. So I thought that was really interesting. That comes across a lot in these studies. People tend to, we think consumers are choosing them because they think they're more environmentally friendly. It might be true, but it's really, they're driven by, might be curious, or they think they're healthier food products. And then we asked them, well, going forward, what are some of how important are the following motivations in your plans to consume these products in the future? So these are people that have already consumed them. So the blue bars, I would avoid the product for these reasons, and the green, that's a reason to try. And again, if you look at nutrition, personal health in the middle, that's one of the strongest reasons people say, I'm going to keep consuming this because I think it's healthier. And also I like the taste of it. We asked people who'd never consumed a plant-based meat alternative, why might you in the future? And again, the same colours here, blue, reason to avoid, green, reason to try. So people will avoid them because they think they're too expensive, they don't think they like the taste. But the reason, another strong reason to avoid, well, I actually think they're unnatural, so naturalness. So that's one of the real tensions this sector has. To make something that simulates meat, the taste and texture, you need a lot of ingredients. This is a highly processed food product, and there's a pushback about that now. So I think it's really quite interesting, that tension between, I want to consume less meat, I might think it's more environmental or healthier, but I don't want highly processed products. And I think that comes across here. Amount of processing and naturalness are strong reasons for some of these consumers saying, no, I don't want to touch these food products. And then lastly, that study where we looked at labelling. So this paper just came out, Beyond Labels, Exploring Consumer Preferences for Plant-Based Meat Labelling Policies. So a lot of my work is based with consumer surveys. So this was a survey with a discrete choice experiment, and this is where we're trying to get at this idea about whether you're allowed to call it burger, sausage. Does it matter in terms of how consumers respond? So we had, it's a fun survey actually, we had 3 labelling treatments. So some of the, one labelling treatment was where, let's suppose there was a ban on the use of meat-related terms. So again, some US states, France did that for a while. Suppose you couldn't use the term burger, as you'll see in a minute, or sausage or whatever. The second information treatment was you're allowed to call it burger with a qualifying statement, and that's the regulatory situation in Canada. You can say plant-based burger, but you have to have made with simulated meat, so it requires a qualifier, so it's not misleading. And then the last scenario was, what if there were no restrictions? It was a free-for-all, food companies could do what they wanted, how might consumers respond? And I'll show you examples of that in just a second. And then a secondary question was that one I mentioned, how do people respond to a health, a protein, complete source of protein, extra source of protein versus that environmental claim on these food products? So we used images of beef products or plant-based beef products in our discrete choice experiment. So I've got on the screen here the three examples of the three regulatory labelling environments for those three things. So the one on the left, ground beef, certified carbon neutral, and a small print at the bottle, made with pea protein. So that was how we thought, if it was unregulated, what might food firms do? Well, they would probably still say it was pea protein, because a bunch of their consumers really want to consume pea, but they might put that in small print. And you can see this one happens to have that environmental claim, certified carbon neutral. So that's a pea protein product marketed as ground beef. The one in the middle is the qualifier treatment. So this would be how it might be labelled in Canada: plant-based ground beef made with pea protein, simulated meat product, contains no meat. So that statement, simulated meat product contains no meat, is a regulatory requirement in Canada. And then we have that environmental claim, certified carbon neutral, and say a complete source of protein. And then the one on the far side is, what might this be if there was this ban on the use of plant-based, meat-related terms. So you couldn't call it beef or ground or mince or whatever. So we chose the term crumble. Crumble is a term I think that Beyond Meat has been using. So it's suppose you couldn't call it ground or mince or whatever, plant-based crumble made with pea protein and so forth. So of course in the discrete choice experiment we varied the presence of the environmental label, the different health claim labels, and the prices across these things. So in the survey, people did 6 of these choices. Imagine you're shopping for a ground meat product in a grocery store with the following options. Which would you choose? And then again, they saw 6 of these. Are you probably familiar with the discrete choice experiment a little bit? Yeah. So just very high level, what did we find? Strong preference for, and some of these were actual beef, not plant-based, and a lot of the study finds a strong preference for the beef product over the plant-based. That's not surprising. But that regulatory environment did seem to matter. So whether they could call it ground or crumb, use plant-based, use meat-related terms was very important. We did find that the qualifier, so having to say contains simulated meat, actually performed really similarly to a ban on meat-related terms. So I think, again, that howl of protest from the beef industry is probably an overreaction. Consumers are not confused, and if you have a qualifier, it informs consumers. Again, we found the health as protein claims elicited a much stronger demand response than an environmental claim. That's very, again, similar to these motivations. So that seems to be stronger, it resonates more with consumers if you can make some kind of health or protein claim. But a caveat, of course, consumers are highly heterogeneous, and we use a latent class model to sort of tease out some of that heterogeneity among those consumers. So just to wrap up, I kind of love this area. I think food and how consumers make food choices is it's a sort of fascinating area in terms of behavioural, how people respond to information and labels and verification and who do consumers trust. I think the second point is also relevant. I haven't worked in this area, but sort of behavioural responses to prices, of course, is important, taxes and subsidies. But again, and you would know more about this than I, we're measuring changes in behaviour or consumption. Are we actually capturing if this has an impact on long-run health outcomes? I think that's really challenging, and that might be something we want to chat about. I haven't talked this morning much about this, but a lot of this work also digs into how values, so food values influence consumer food choices, trust, knowledge, risk preferences. So in all these surveys, we have metrics that measure consumers' risk preferences and knowledge. Often attitudes towards science and technology is really important in trying to understand how that affects consumer attitudes. And again, that last point, of course, consumers are really heterogeneous. So often we're using latent class models to sort of tease out some of that heterogeneity and to tell a story about how different segments of consumers make different decisions. So that's it. I covered a lot of ground this morning, but happy to take any questions or have a bit of a discussion. So how are we doing on time? Well, not too bad. A little bit longer than I planned, but
well, I think we have a touch first.
I'll just set up the screen really quickly so we can see colleagues online, and then we can identify if anyone's got any questions.
Thank you, Jill, very much.
Fantastic. And I'll put the camera to the room as well.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
While you're getting sorted, I'm going to take the privilege of asking a question, which is, I am fascinated by Deliveroo. Do you have Deliveroo?
We have similar skip dishes.
So we don't really have it here around North. My children came home and said, "Oh, we'll just order," and then that's not happening.
Okay.
The nearest pizza place 10 miles away. So you mentioned the food spending outside the home. Does that include delivery food to the home?
Yes, because that would be, you're purchasing from a restaurant, aren't you? So that would be included in that.
Because that's a very different experience. I'm really, so that was one question. And the second question was, there are other things that affect people's choices. Obviously about food, obviously there's price, but there are things like food miles and politics. Like there may be countries where you don't want to buy an avocado from, or whatever. So do those, how do you pick the variables that you really want to look at when there are other things going on as well?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's driven by what you said, what's the research question we're trying to answer? So in this plant-based meat one, we were really trying to just understand partly that sort of health, whether the protein claim versus the environment one, and there's obviously a limited number of things you can put in a discrete choice experiment as well. But I think trying to, I usually have the students, what's the model you're going to estimate ahead of time, and what do we think are the main variables that need to go in there? But some of the food values I talked about, I haven't really discussed them, but there's a group of researchers came out with 11 of these so-called food values that influence food choices. And so that's environment, taste, nutrition, health, food safety. So that's often a useful way to start to see, do we think animal welfare, do we think these factors are important in that regard? But no, that's exactly.
Yeah, there's some interesting that since Mr. Trump
is
making claims about taking over Canada and stuff, orange juice sales have just plummeted.
Yeah.
Because we import orange juice from Florida, so they just. So it'd be interesting to see, Moran's saying, what about political motivations? Well,
I've done some also work on sort of country of origin labelling, and people tend to gravitate towards their own country in that sense, for obvious reasons. But in this context, a lot of consumers right now are avoiding US-made products if they can. But that assumes a label's accurate. So that's been some of the conversation about retailers mislabeling food products as Canadian when in fact they're obviously not. Avocado oil is obviously not made in Canada because we don't grow avocados. But other questions? Yes.
I wanted to find out, how does demographics play in this? Because for the younger generation, I feel they'll be more open to try a lot of things compared to the older ones.
Yeah.
And also race, culture. I think you come to religion as well.
Yes,
could play
absolutely.
a huge part in trying some of this new food.
Yeah, no, that's right. I had a PhD student work with a few years ago, and we looked at cultural values, so some of how that affects food consumption, absolutely. And there's a scale called food neophobia, so that's fear of new things. So there's an old scale developed in the early 90s about just measuring, some people are more open to trying new foods and some are not. So that was that's a validated scale. So we often use that in surveys as well to look at that. And then I was talking to my students in a class last year. Again, they're mostly agriculture-based students from, and one of them argued, young people are much more adventurous with their food. Older people don't want to try new things. And then I think I had a graphic up about insect protein, because that's a big growth category. And I said, who here would be willing to try that? And they went, oh no. I said, what happened to sort of adventurous young people you told me you were? So, but that could be particularly. So often, you're right, we're capturing some of these variables. I think the challenge we always face is you can't throw everything in a survey, so it's coming back to what are we really trying to get at with our research questions. So, yes, please.
I was just wondering, whilst you were presenting, around the concerning emerging trend around behaviour change, in particular in young people, around actually substituting food and making that choice to take up that diet medication.
Ah, right, yeah.
So whether or not that was something that was being kind of explored now around that unhealthy trend.
I haven't looked at that, but there's been some discussions on what that might do in terms of, you know, how people are responding to that. There's something on the radio about that the other day, and they're also arguing, but it also might make, if it makes people more aware of what they're eating, perhaps they might exercise more. I don't know, but I think that's a really interesting question in terms of, you know, how that's going to affect decisions, or what's the long-term implications of consuming them or using those diet-related.
And people selecting to take the pills rather than actually eat.
Yeah, those, yeah. So all of those types of issues that might develop. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Oh. Please, yeah.
I was just wondering about any differences with people that are living in more rural areas, maybe with trust with farmers, or sort of, you know, buying locally, that kind of thing.
Yeah, we certainly measure that, and we certainly, trust in farmers is higher. That's growing in Canada, trust in farmers, which is interesting, yeah. But certainly, and politically, that makes a difference in Canada. So the rural areas tend to be a little more conservative, so that might influence some of how they think about food or who they trust. So this, when we measure trust, we tend to measure it in two ways. So there's generalized trust. So are you a trusting person? So there's, again, scales where, yes, I would lend money to people. But then the institutional trust is what we're really, you know, so trust in government, trust in retailers, trust in farmers, and so forth. So that's, in Canada, we've tended in the past to have quite a high level of trust in government, and the US really low. So I think that's really quite interesting how that changes over time. But and some of my students get frustrated, think, consumers just don't understand farmers, and they, you know, I said, well, why should they? They're not from farms.
Cars made.
Yeah, exactly. So you know, my colleague said, you know, Apple wouldn't sell many iPhones if they told their consumers they're all stupid, and you know, consumers are stupid, they don't trust farmers. Well, you know, you've got to tell the story a little bit more convincingly to do that. So exactly. Yeah. Rihanna, yeah.
I've got a question, just because there's a lot of talk about Wegovy and some of the other weight management drugs, anti-obesity drugs, because they cause satiation, so they dampen appetite. But what they don't do is help change attitudes to what you're eating. And then the evidence seems to be that when you come off them, you just pile that weight back on again. And I think there's some very interesting work to be done in attitudes to choices to, is that really an easy option? Because obviously if that's prescribed on the NHS, it's very, very expensive for the number of people who potentially could benefit in terms of reducing risks of type 2 diabetes and heart disease. But really the behaviours it's possibly seen as a quick fix rather than changing behaviours.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be used alone, right? It must have to come with other stuff that...
No, they can just be bought over the...
No, but I mean, if you want it to be effective, you presumably need to do more than just prescribe a drug. You have to have people... No, but if you want it to be effective, you have to do, you know, you'd have to say, now let's also change your behaviour and move beyond
but that's not how it's happening.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people just buying them through Boots or Asda or whatever.
Morrison's,
they sell,
And of course, but what that's not doing is teaching people about that food plate.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So yeah, by itself, that's not a solution, I guess, is what you're saying, right? But
I was just going to ask if there's any work in the field of technology and how it influences people's choices. So like you can order things over apps, and then when you get to the pay now, it says, would you like to add, like the upselling?
Oh yeah, the upselling, yeah.
I'm guessing that will be paired with your likely purchasing habit, because they have loads of data about people buy this.
Yes, yeah, that's right. The algorithms they could use to. No, that's a really good point, actually. Yeah, I haven't seen any work on that, but I'm sure that's people looking at, exactly, because they're using an algorithm to get you to buy more food in that sense, or less healthy food. Or I think we sometimes, I must admit, when it's February in Saskatoon and it's -40 and we haven't got any food, and I go online and we can get it delivered then. But I do think you've got half an hour to add more to your order. I think, well, no, I don't need to add any more. He can pick up some Coke for you on the way around, some Coca-Cola. No, I don't need any of that. But, yeah, so.
Could I ask a question? I'm really struggling in my mind to formulate it, but essentially what I'm trying to think is, in terms of influencing these population behaviours, should we be focusing on like the supply, so maybe the availability of food, or on like the demand for it? Because I guess there may be some form of just like dynamic response back and forth. Because if I go to the shop and there's all unhealthy foods available, then my behaviour, I may purchase those more unhealthy foods, and then they might be like, oh, they're buying these loads, let's pump more in again. So I'm trying to think where the response mechanism maybe is, or so I really struggled to formulise it in my head.
No, I know what you mean. I think that's part of that the environment. So if someone only has access to unhealthy food, they're going to consume more of it. So is there an intervention to try and get more grocery stores? But at the end of the day, these are private firms, so you can't tell them to stock less unhealthy food. With the planning regulations that you have to have a grocery store here or something with fresh vegetables and fruit.
From a public health perspective, I think there is an acknowledgement that you have to make the good choice easy. So, for example, they now put folic acid into bread, and the salt reduction has been considerable, and just no one has to choose.
You could.
But then you could say, well, we're just, and that's a good paternalistic motive, isn't it, for society? But people might say, well, you're removing consumer choice.
No, that's right. I think that's an interesting political tension. If you look at the US with Robert F. Kennedy in terms of, wanting to remove vaccinations and all, so in the whole debate over fluoride in water, it's the same thing, right? Done that for years. So I think that I was a little concerned about the debate shifting the other way in terms of you're removing choice, yes, but it's a good outcome if you put folic acid in bread and so forth, and fluoride in water. So, that's interesting.
I know on another project I'm working on at the moment, there was discussion yesterday on a group I'm on with different academics in the US that they're now banning the use of the term social determinants of health and the sexuality within presentations and research and grant discussion, which I find really
it is shocking actually, in terms of you can't mention, I think in the US they can't mention environment or climate change in grants, and that's quite concerning. And there's lots of great research that goes on there, and that we benefit from, all of us. So I think
are they being stopped to publish papers?
No, but their grants are being cut, I think, and their student funding is cut and so forth.
Big brother.
But
do we have any questions or comments online from anybody? I haven't seen any hands up, and I haven't seen anything through the chat, but there's an opportunity if anyone online wants to ask a question. No, don't see them. You have another one in the room, Victor?
Yes.
Is there any study that measures the health benefit of switching to maybe more plant-based kind of, any study that shows the benefits of it?
I'm sure there are. I haven't sort of looked at that in detail. I'm more looking at why consumers are switching to those food products. But that plant-based meat alternative that sector really grew, and it's tapered off in recent years, I think, because it's more expensive, so it tends to be wealthier consumers, obviously, that can buy these types of plant-based meat alternatives in that sense. But I think you'd probably need, because it's a new category, you'd need a lot more longer run data to see whether, and of course it's just one part of your diet, so I don't know how, it'd be hard to measure whether switching to that, just a plant-based meat alternative, led to improved health outcomes. Would be difficult to know. And again, they're more processed food products. I think that's a really interesting tension in that sense of, we had another, I didn't talk about it, but we had one, I mentioned it briefly, I guess, study where we looked at ingredient lists, short versus long ingredient lists. So to make these products, you need a lot of ingredients. So how might consumers respond to, and unsurprisingly, people prefer shorter ingredients lists, more natural sounding ingredients, and that's one of the challenges that sectors grapple with. If you're going to mimic meat, then you need to put more stuff in it to make it look like meat and taste like meat and so forth. But Yeah.
Found it interesting. I was in M&S the other day, and now they got a bread, which is the flagship bread, only 4 ingredients, and I'm like, how many ingredients are in normal bread? And I looked online, and I was like, what is that?
Yes, that's
so
right.
No, it's just flour. And I thought, okay, then that's
yeah,
bread should
yeah.
be.
So it's that's right. So-called clean labels. The marketers
Yes.
call it. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
And what would you say would be success for you in this particular field?
What would we say that?
What would you classify as being successful in your field? The study that you're doing.
What would be successful?
What would you classify as? What would you say is I've achieved something?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's if you've influenced a policy. To me, that's a really interesting thing. So a lot of stuff's looked at. Food labelling, has that informed some policy down the road, and that's hard to, and that impact in that sense would be the interesting thing. So maybe not the ones I talked about there, but I did some previous work on traceability. There's lots of and food safety economics, so has that had an influence in that way in terms of informed how they think about food? But again, it's hard to know if you've had that influence, but that might be part of it, I suppose. Yeah. Bill looks like he's got a question.
No.
Okay.
Just the same thing. Like, a long time ago, I was teaching farmers, and they rubbished you in the class, and these were mid-aged farmers, 20s and 30s. But I was around quite a long time. I was teaching. I was in a rural area, and I was around quite a while. And after about 4 weeks, I began to hear my lectures. And I could go to a farm meeting usually. I hear my lectures, so like when I gave the lecture, you begin to hear your own words come back. So you don't know.
No, you don't really know.
What the influence is.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I'm going to thank Jill.
There's one more question, I think.
Oh, one more, sorry.
Yeah.
Well, go for it. I was just going to jump in because on Amnesty we have the early school years healthy eating program. So it's all free school meals and they're trying to be all healthy choices. But we don't see many of, or at least in my child's school, we don't see many of the plant-based alternatives. Even though they offer vegan options and vegetarian options. So I was just thinking it'd be interesting to see the long-term impact because I think it's quite a relatively new thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a new thing. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's interesting. They do that. So, there was a study that reminds me of out of the US where they were looking at how do you get children in schools to pick the healthier, not the chocolate milk, but the non-chocolate. When they're choosing food products in the canteen, they were looking at a prompt so that a person in authority like the teacher said, try the white milk, not the chocolate milk. So they found that kids picked up more of these or pick up the vegetables, but of course they didn't necessarily eat these healthier food products. So I think that's another thing. They choose them, but then they leave them on their plates. So I thought that was quite an interesting study. That depends what you're measuring, right? Are you measuring whether they've eaten those vegetables and the healthier food products at the end of the school day or not? But I thought that was quite a good study.
Remembering your experience with school.
Oh, my school, I don't know, school dinners were awful when I was a kid. Maybe, hopefully they've improved, I don't know.
We give kids breakfast now. I mean, it's an indictment of socio-economic problems that kids are arriving at school without breakfast.
Hungry, yeah.
I am going to just say thank you to Jill, but before I do, I'm going to say 10 years ago, Bill, Jill and I think it's about 10 years ago, we spoke at the Welsh Economics Colloquium, which was down in I've forgotten the place.
Gruggonog,
Gruggonog. And we did hold one of our health economics meetings there. Some of the people who've been around a bit longer will remember. And we gave papers, and then the guy who was sort of coordinating it all, Professor Dennis Thomas, he was our lecturer in Aberystwyth, and he pulled out our essay from a drawer that he kept. It's just hilarious. So this continues with having invited you here and Bill here to give this seminar, and then we have got a serious plan to try and write papers.
We really should, yes. I think
we haven't got our heads around it yet,
no.
But if people have any ideas and would like to join on this project, please let us know, and we might see if John Parkinson's available. He's behavioural psychologist.
Okay.
Good if he was involved.
Yeah.
But we've got a plan, haven't we?
Yes, we have sort of.
Yeah, so that's what we're going to be talking about in the next 24 hours before you move on. But thank you.
Well,
very
no, thank
much.
you for the
It's very
invitation. This has been great to meet you all.
Yeah.
There is no shortage.
No, there is no shortage of questions. Quite right, Bill. Thank you to everybody who set the room up.